Hey guys, welcome back to Reignited. Now we are again working on our Twin Charged Magnum project here. In our last episode, you saw me tear down that original engine. You saw just how bad the carnage was. That engine was completely smoked. In this episode, we're going to start building up the new heart of the beast. This time around, we've got 392 Scat Pack power. Now, if you guys are wondering, this is not just a random 6.4 block out of a truck. Obviously, the orange is somewhat distinctive here. This is only for the SRT model, so they went with this orange paint. So this actually came out of a 2017 Grand Cherokee SRT. So not really a whole lot of differences between this engine and what comes in a Challenger Charger. I would say a camshaft is the primary difference. The cams that come in these give you just a little bit more torque, but a little bit less horsepower. Doesn't matter, the original cam is long gone in this thing. This was yet another engine I picked up because it actually had a cam lifter failure. So I purchased the core on this thing, cleaned up the block, did a light hone on these cylinders, basically just to get rid of the glaze on there. So we have a perfect starting platform here. Now, there's a few different reasons why I upgraded to the 6.4 platform at this time. One of the primary reasons, though, is because the 6.4 engines have piston oil squirters in there. Essentially, these are connected to a high-pressure oil gallery, and it sprays pressurized oil on the back side of the pistons, cooling them down and keeping them from getting too hot. Now, obviously, as you saw the carnage from my last engine, I'm a little bit worried about stuff like that. So even with forged internals that we're putting in this thing, I do want to have all the prevention measures that I possibly can. These oil squirters are going to be a big help with that. One of the other reasons why I went to the 6.4 platform over the 5.7 is because all of the 6.4 engines come with a forged crankshaft. So that's one less component I really have to think about. I didn't want to have to purchase a very expensive forged crank for a 5.7 when I already have a 6.4 engine lying around and I can have that forged crank in there. Now, to go along with that, we also needed some forged pistons and rods. So for that, I turned to Modern Muscle Extreme and I got their drop-in kit for the 6.4 liter. Now, this comes with Manley connecting rods and Molly pistons, and they claim on their website that this is capable of 1,000 rear wheel horsepower, and they've even seen some of their builds go beyond that point. Now, that's great news because I have no intention of making that much power at this time. Now, I've never explicitly stated it, but my power goals for this car, I've always talked about it being the poor man's hellcat. I'd love it if it made hellcat-ish type power. So my stated goal for this car is 650 rear wheel horsepower. I know that's not a mind-blowing number, but to me that's a stable number that it should be able to reliably make for a long period of time. So that's the goal, and with the 14 PSI that it should be making, I don't think that's going to be a problem, but I don't want to have to eat my words too soon. Let's get this thing together and then we'll actually get it dynoed and find out what it's actually making. Now, just a couple of additional supporting modifications I'm going to do as we put this engine together. I do have that new Melling high volume oil pump, the 10452 HV pump. I'm excited to try this thing out and see what it can do. I'm sure this thing's going to be putting out some great numbers. And also, I got a set of ARP head studs for the Hemi engine. Now, I have to say, I've bought a lot of different car parts throughout the decades here, but these ARP head studs have to be one of the most overpriced things you can possibly buy. It's just a bunch of bolts and it's $400. I am mind blown by that. I mean, they're nice fasteners. I've used ARP stuff before. I have them in my 6 liter. I've had them in a couple other vehicles as well, but $400 for a set of head studs? It is absolutely unreal expensive. I have no idea how they justify that cost. I do have a new set of main bearings here, as well as some new thrust bearings. And we have to make a modification with our trigger wheel as well, now that we're switching over to the 6.4 engine, but we'll cover that in a little bit. Now, one thing that I am still waiting for on this build is the new camshaft that I need for it. Now, this camshaft here is what was in my 5.7 that I took out, and this is actually a stock 6.4 liter camshaft, which can be an upgrade on your 5.7 engine, but I'm not going to be using it in this 6.4 liter build. The reason is because on this 05 Magnum, I do not have any sort of VVT functionality. I can't control that with a factory PCM because it never came with VVT. I'm using HP tuners, so it can only control what's already there in the computer. This did not have VVT, therefore I have no controlling of that, which means that the camshaft phaser is constantly in the full advanced position, which gives me great low-end torque, but again, because I have no way to actually change the phaser on that engine, it never advanced to give me that top-end power. So what I've done here is I moved on to an aftermarket camshaft that does not make use of that VVT functionality. That way, the cam, right from the start, will give me that great top end power, because I'm not really that concerned about bottom end power. I mean, it's a 6.4 liter with a supercharger on there. Probably not that critical. Okay, the trigger wheel is very important on this build, and the reason for that is because this being an 05 Magnum, the stock PCM wants to read an old style trigger wheel. The newer trigger wheels have much more teeth on them. They won't read the wheel that goes on a 6.4 liter, so you need to swap to a wheel that has the original pattern of the 03 to 08 engines. Now, I originally got this trigger wheel when I was first building this thing, because my assumption was that the 09 and up 5.7 liter engines used a 4-bolt flange. That turned out not to be the case. They still have a 3-bolt flange. So I was able to just do a direct swap between the old crank and the new crank. However, now that we're going to the 6.4 liter, it turns out the 6.4 crankshaft has the 4-bolt flange. So this trigger wheel that I already purchased is a direct fit onto this crank, and we should have no problems with making it run. Now I'm gonna go ahead and post a link in the description down below. I got this thing off of eBay and it was really cheap. I can't remember how much right now. It was like $30, $40 maybe. And this is actually a really nice piece. I'm not sure who makes this, but they did a great job on it. I think it might be laser cut. This is really nice, especially for the price. And you know, making it to where I can just bolt this thing on and go, terrific product, guys. Good job. Now, what is especially nice about these is that these bolt holes are staggered, which means that this thing will only bolt on one way, so there's no way to get it incorrect on the crankshaft. We'll make sure we're going to use some Loctite here on these bolts. You don't want this thing coming off. Now with this new crank trigger wheel installed, this 6.4 liter will run just as well as the original 5.7 did in that 05 Magnum. All right, I'm getting ready to install our main bearings here so that we can install the crank on this engine. Now, sometimes people tend to ask me, hey, I noticed you're not checking bearing clearances when you're putting these engines together. And that's true. On most engines that I do, I don't check those clearances. And the reason for that is because I'm using factory stock components. I'm using stock crank, stock block, stock bearings in there. So the reality is that everything should be just fine. Obviously, sure, if you want to double check those numbers, you can. But in my experience, when using stock, everything goes together just fine and there's not a problem. Now, if I'd have had some machine work done, if I'd had the crankshaft journals turned down or something of that nature, absolutely 1000% I would be checking those clearances. But like I said, in my long experience of doing quite a few different engines, throughout my job as a technician and doing it for a hobby, I found that as long as I'm using stock components, everything goes together just fine with no problem. There's a lot of people out there who have a problem with that. I'm just telling you, this is my experience, so I have no problem putting an engine together like this. I have never had any sort of a bearing issue on an engine I've put together in the past. Now, with that being said, I do have something a little bit interesting happening with this engine. Now, this 6.4 liter engine has what's called select fit bearings for the main bearings. Now, what that means is that each crank journal has a specific bearing size that is assigned to it. Now, you can read that on the front counterweight of the crankshaft itself. It has it stamped in there what they are. Now, there's an A, a B, and a C. And what that is undersized, standard, and oversized. But one thing I want to clarify here is that when we think undersized or oversized, we're thinking like 10,000ths difference between the two. No, that is not the case. Between the A, which is the smallest bearing, and the C, which is the largest bearing, there's a difference of 1/2 of 1,000th of an inch. All right, that is microscopic. All right, now we're not building space shuttles here, we're building engines, and because I'm running an oil pump that provides maximum oil volume here, I want to give as much room as I can with these bearings for that oil flow. So I have all C's all the way across the board, so the maximum size bearings here all the way down. Now, again, this is completely different than if I had ordered oversized main bearings for this engine. All right, I hope you guys are clear on all that. Let's go ahead and get these things installed. Okay, finally gonna start going together with this engine. Now, the first thing we want to install here are going to be our thrust bearings. Now, what's nice about these is that they have these little tangs built into them, so they only go one way into the block. You can't actually mix these two things up. Now, what these things do is they control thrust. That's why they're called thrust bearings. And essentially, what it's talking about is the crankshaft walking back and forth. It controls that. It allows the crank to run up against this surface and kind of bump up against it like that but not actually damage anything. So these are critical to make sure that we get inside the engine. Let's go ahead and do that now. Now I like to use a little bit of engine assembly lube to throw on there, just to help them like stick into place, because you don't want them falling out as you're trying to put the crankshaft in place. We'll go ahead and coat the face of that bearing as well. Now when it comes to the main bearings themselves, there's two different halves here. You'll notice that this one has the groove in the hole, and this one is completely smooth. The one with the groove in the hole needs to be oriented with your oil hole right here. So there's a little tang on the back side of the bearing itself. We'll just slip that into place. Press it down in. And there we go. Now your bearing can be oiled properly. And this side goes in the main cap just like that. All right, now we don't want to forget to lubricate all of these bearings as well. And now we're ready to drop our crankshaft into place. Here we go. Now, one of the great things about the Hemi main caps is that they are stamped not only with which number main it is, but also what direction the cap goes in. So there's really no way to install these things incorrectly. Now to torque our main caps here, we're going to start in the center and work our way out, and we're going to do an initial run of 20 foot-pounds, and then we're going to do an additional 90-degree turn on top of that to reach our final number. Now it can be good practice that after you do your final torque procedure for that bolt, that you go ahead and mark it, that way you know for certain that it is fully torqued down. In my case, I've done this quite a few different times. I don't need to really do that anymore, but still, it's a good practice to have. Now, if you're wondering, these all seem to be torquing to around 110 foot-pounds. So the torque to angle thing is kind of the path you want to follow. However, if you notice a pattern of exactly how much it's starting to turn out to be, you can also go by that number as well. Now the Hemi engine has what's called cross-bolted main caps. So you have your two bolts that go down, but there's also bolts that come in from the side right here as well. So these bolts are very much smaller. They need to be torqued to an initial run of 15 foot-pounds and then a final torque of 21 foot-pounds. Okay, at this point we have our main caps fully torqued down. What I should be able to do is I should be able to spin this crankshaft by hand right now. If I can't spin it, something has gone wrong. I need to fix that before I move on. And you can see, no problem at all. Crankshaft is spinning perfectly. Now, the last thing I'm going to do here on the block before I move on to the pistons and rods is I'm going to install our rear main seal. Very simple, it just slides on the back here, a couple of bolts to hold it in place. It's a done deal. You'll notice when you go to install this that there are a couple of locating dowel pins that helps really seat this thing properly. Do not use the bolts to draw this thing in. Make sure it's sitting flush first before you tighten the bolts down. You could very easily crack this housing. There we go, she's fully seated. We can put our bolts in. Let's transition over to our Molly pistons and our Manley connecting rods. Now, as I mentioned earlier, because these are aftermarket components and I am using aftermarket bearings, I will be checking the bearing clearances here on these connecting rods. These things are pretty. Now they're a coated piston. Oh man, that is nice. These things are not cheap by a mile, but very nice components. Let's take a look at one of these connecting rods. Oh yeah, there we go. Beautiful. Look at that. That ought to be just a little bit stronger than the factory rods are. Now beyond just being forged, there's a couple of things I want to point out here that are differences between these piston styles here. Now the first of which is that the valve reliefs are much more significant on the forged pistons than they are on the stock ones, so you can use that higher lift camshaft. Now also, it's kind of tough to tell, but this center section is actually sunken down a little bit on this piston, whereas it's a dome on the stock pistons. So these stock pistons here are designed for 10.5 compression. I believe this piston with the stock gaskets gives you 10.1 compression. So definitely a little bit more boost friendly there. Now, secondly, if you look here for the piston, look where that top ring is, that ringland is, versus the top of the actual piston itself. Now take a look at the forged ones here. Look how much of a difference there is in height there. So that's where a lot of that strength is going to come from, beyond the fact that these are forged and not cast like these are. And for the connecting rod itself, I don't think there's really any explanation necessary here. Visually, you can see how much bigger and stronger these are going to be. Plus, these are powdered metal rods, and I'll be honest, I think these things are really weak. I'm not a fan of the rods. The pistons, you could probably make do with certain power levels, but the rods, not a huge fan of those. These are going to be a massive upgrade and exactly what I need to make the power that I'm trying to make. Now, in our last video on this project, I seem to have had a lot of new viewers who hadn't actually seen this project before, and I got a lot of really well-intentioned comments basically saying, hey, you've overcomplicated everything. If you just got rid of one or the other of the power adders, you'll be in a much simpler situation. You probably make more horsepower, all of that. I completely understand those comments, and in fact, I agree with those comments. However, simple is not really my game. I did this as a personal challenge to myself to see if I can make this work with the supercharger and the turbocharger. I wanted to complete all of the fabrication involved. It's just a novelty thing for me. Realistically, if I wanted to make a ton more horsepower, I could just dump triple the amount of money in this thing, either go with a massive turbo setup or put a big old supercharger on this thing, and it would easily make more power than the situation that I have right here. I'm not interested in getting into a horsepower war with other people on the internet. I can't play at that financial game, but what I can do is make really unique novelty projects like this, and that's something that I really enjoy. The horsepower numbers aren't really a huge motivating factor for me. What I love is having something that no one else has that's completely unique, and so that's why I built this thing, and that's why I'm excited to get it back together again. Now, along those same lines, another reason why I'm really excited to get this car back together again is because on the 4-hour road trip I took with this car down to Redding, California for the start of that Redwood Rally, this thing drove absolutely fantastic. It was smooth, it was quiet, it was comfortable, and it made all the right noises when you did actually step on the gas pedal. So the thing actually does work functionally really well as a car, which honestly is a little bit more than I can say for my 392 powered C10. Super fun truck, I love that thing, but it's definitely an 80s truck, and it has all the squeaks and rattles and everything that you can expect to go along with that. This car is not that. This car is smooth, it is quiet, like I said, it's comfortable. It's a really nice car, so I want to get this thing back going again as soon as I can. Now, the last reason I don't want to change the setup as it sits is because for that very brief instant before this thing blew up, the concept was proving itself that it was working as it was supposed to do. I could see it in the data logs here, where as soon as I hit the gas, that supercharger was spinning, it was making boost, and it immediately spun up that giant turbocharger. So there was no perceptible lag before it hit the full 14 PSI of boost that this thing is supposed to run. So technically, the concept was working perfectly, and then it blew up. All right, we need to go ahead and assemble our piston and rod combination here. Now, the thing to remember is that on the connecting rod itself, there is a larger shoulder here, and there is a smaller shoulder. Now, the larger shoulder needs to be facing up against the counterweight itself. The smaller shoulder of the two rods are going to be facing each other. So we have these circlips right here that actually hold the wrist pin in place. Now, you truly haven't lived until one of these circlips has sprung away and entered the 5th dimension, and you're looking for it for an hour and a half. So congratulations to those of you who have gone through that before. You've passed the test. So there's a little groove here inside the piston itself that these circlips fit into, and they can be very difficult, obviously. Now, the one thing you don't want to do is you don't want to squeeze these things shut with a pair of pliers or something until they fit in there easily. Obviously, you want to maintain that tension. So much like a snap ring, I'll kind of basically put the first end into the groove itself, and then I'll work it around until it's actually fully seated in there. And sometimes I'll use a pair of needle nose here to grab onto the end of it and help push it in there. All right, so right here it's not quite fully seated. Give it a little push. There we go. That circlip is in there. All right, now we're gonna put the connecting rod in there. We're gonna slide our wrist pin into place. There we go. And then now we just need to enter in our second circlip over here on this side. There we go. All right, there we go. And now we have our piston rod assembled. Now I just need to do that 7 more times. Now our next thing we're going to do here is install our VVT lock kit. Now this is a Comp Cams kit, part number 5760CPG. And the reason I'm locking this out is because, as I mentioned, this 05 Magnum has no VVT functionality at all, so I'm just gonna lock it out. And that should be just fine with this melling cam that I'm using. Now, if you are using this melling cam shaft and you have an 09 and up with that VVT capability, my recommendation to you would be just install a VVT limiter. That way you can still take advantage of some of that VVT functionality and give you that best of both worlds. In my case, I don't have that capability, so I'm just locking it out. Now this Comp Cams phaser lock kit comes with a set of instructions. They're very simple instructions, but make sure you follow them exactly, because if you do not, there's a good chance that you will actually ruin your phaser and you'll have to buy a whole nother one. So again, follow these instructions very closely. All right, the kit comes with this special tool here, and it's designed to relieve the spring pressure here. You have a couple of large springs inside here, so this actually fits over this pin right here, right down in there. And then we just want to go ahead and tighten the bolt here. There we go. As mentioned, that just removes the spring pressure off of this pin. So, next step, there's a locating pin right here on the back of the phaser for a timing gear. Directly opposite to that pin, this bolt right here, you want to loosen this. Do not remove it. That's the one key here. If you remove both of these bolts, those springs will pop apart and you will have to get a new phaser. So again, the bolt directly opposite to your locating pin, this guy here, just loosen this bolt only and then remove the other 4 bolts. And then this plate will actually swivel out of the way so we can install that lock pin. So let's do that. Now that we have those bolts out, we just swivel the top piece out of the way, which gives us access to our cavities here in the cam phaser. And this is where our little lock device here will get slid down into one of those openings, and there's a little pipe plug here that screws down inside that and actually opens it up a little bit to provide tension to hold it in there tightly. And then, oh, there we go. And then we just slide this back into place and put it back together. Now they do mention that you should put a little bit of Loctite on this plug to keep it from backing out. I'm not really sure why. There's nowhere that this plug can go, but we're gonna do it anyway because that's what they recommend. All right, we have our lock kit installed here with the plug installed. Now we just have to swivel the backing plate back into place, and we'll go ahead and put these bolts back into place. Now these bolts get torqued to 14 foot-pounds. As soon as these are all torqued back down, you can flip it over, remove this tool, and your phaser is ready to go, fully locked. Our phaser is completely locked. It's ready to be installed on our engine. A couple of things to note here. These connecting rods are made out of 4340 chromoly steel, and they're shot peen. I mean, these things are ridiculously strong. Also, you'll notice on the actual rod cap itself that it has these dowel pin locators to actually help give it rigidity both forward and back and side to side and strength. Now the factory rods are what's called a fractured cap rod, which means that it's cast in one piece and then they use a special machine to break it. And that way it has a jagged surface on each end of the rod itself, and that gives it its strength forward and back and side to side. In this case, we're using these dowels here. Now, of course, the ARP rod bolts here are very much thicker and stronger than the factory rod bolts are. These are also reusable, so that's a nice thing because the factory ones are not reusable. All right, we went ahead and installed our bearings here. We're gonna go ahead and check our rod bearing clearance in the engine itself. Let's go ahead and do that right now. Now to check our bearing clearances, we're going to be using what's called plastic gauge. Now essentially this is just like a thin plastic that you put down on the bearing surface itself. Go ahead and clamp the rod down, torque it down to the proper specification, pull that cap back off and find out just how smushed this plastic has become. Now how wide it is, you measure it against the gauge right here, kind of a ruler, and it'll tell you what that clearance is, whether it's 2,000ths or 3,000ths, which is what our specification is on this engine. Kind of low tech, but still pretty effective. All right, now we got our marking on our bearing surface here. We're going to take our little ruler here, measure it, and you can see we're exactly at 2 thousandths, which is exactly where we want to be for our bearing clearance. Well, it's as simple as that. We've measured our bearing clearance. Now I went ahead and measured all the other ones off camera. They are all within spec as well, so we are ready to start assembling here. Now the next thing we're going to move on to is our piston rings. Now Molly makes it very straightforward to put on your piston rings. They have them labeled top ring, second ring, and your oil rings here. And as far as your gap goes, they have a nice little guide here to go by as far as how big you want that gap to be. Now according to this guide, on a turbo or supercharged application, I need to have a minimum of 25 thousandths gap for my top ring and a minimum of 28 thousandths for my second ring. Now I'm gonna gap that just a little bit larger than that. I'm gonna go 28 thousandths for the top ring, and I'm gonna go 30 thousandths for the secondary ring. So that should put me in a good place with these. Now that last one, that engine you saw that I blew up the second time, I had opened up the ring gap quite a bit on there because I didn't want to deal with ring gland failure. I had somewhere around 40 thousandths to like 42 thousandths gap on those pistons. Maybe that's why I didn't have ring gland failure that time. It looks like I must have just ate a valve there on that exhaust valve. I think that's probably what happened there. But yeah, definitely wasn't ring gland failure second time around. But the downside of having 40 thousandths plus of gap is that I did have a pretty significant amount of blow by. I want to reduce that as much as I can. So again, top ring 28 thousandths, second ring 30 thousandths, we should be in good shape. All right, the way we want to do this here is this is our top ring. There's a little M here for Molly. That means this is the top side. I'm going to go ahead and slip that into the cylinder. Then we want to use the top side of a piston here, push it down level, just like that. And now the piston ring is perfectly even in there and we can actually check our gap. Now I'm starting with 25 thousandths here. I want to sneak up on this. And as it sits, we're nowhere close to that. So we definitely need to open up these rings a fair bit. All right, we just have my little cheapo ring filer here, and this thing works just fine. I've got it set up to run off of a drill, but you got to be careful here because obviously you can take material away, but you can't add it back in. And one thing you want to make sure to do is make sure that you're taking material evenly off of one of these ends here. You don't want it to be angled one way or the other. You want when the ends come together, you want them to butt up nice and flat right against each other. All right, we'll start with that and continue checking. Now, once you get the ring gap where you want it, go ahead and take a small file and clean off any possible burrs that there could be on the end of the ring from where you filed it. Okay, a final check at 28 thousandths for our top ring, and you can see we are right on the money here, just loose enough to allow that to slip through there. So this ring's ready to go. So as you can see, kind of a tedious process there, but what I like to do is I like to go cylinder by cylinder, and then when they're all done, I'll lay them out on a clean surface and then put them on the corresponding piston and install them into the engine. By the way, I do apologize for the fan in the background, but I am glad that my shop heater actually works because it's a bit of a winter wonderland out here today. We're getting our worst storm of the winter so far, and it just keeps coming down. All right, I've got all my piston rings set to size. Now I need to go ahead and load them on the pistons and get these things inside the engine. Okay, we've got all of our pistons completely assembled. We have all the piston rings in there, the rod bearings are in there, they're ready to go into the engine. And to do that, we get to use one of my absolutely favorite tools. This is a tapered piston ring installer here. This is the 104 millimeter for the 6.4 liter engines. It makes this job so much easier. Now, it is not foolproof. You still gotta be careful when you're putting those things in so you don't pinch a ring. But if you do it the right way, man, these things just slide right into place. So let's get these in the engine. Now I gave these cylinders one last wipe down to make sure they're nice and clean. I'm gonna add some fresh oil right now to make sure that these pistons slide in there smoothly and for our first startup. All right, there it is, you guys. We have our pistons installed. This is our 1,000 wheel horsepower capable short block here. Now, I don't have the camshaft yet. I'll have that in the next couple of days. So you guys will see that in the next episode when we finish up our assembly of the engine itself and do a little bit of fabrication. Now, you'll notice I didn't actually torque the rod bolts yet. I didn't want to do that because I want to wait until I grab my torque wrench from work. I know it is much more accurate than the one I have here, so I want to make sure that this thing's done right. But let's go ahead and spin this thing over. Make sure she's spinning smoothly. All right, it's looking good to me. Perfect. I'm so excited about this. This is fantastic. I want to thank you guys so much for watching as always. We'll see you next time on Reignited.